Good morning. Good morning. I'm Leonard Baines, Dean of the University of Houston Law Center. Welcome to our 30th anniversary Frankel Lecture. Many thanks to the Frankel family for the generosity to the Law Center and the Law Review in funding and supporting this really incredible conversation for the past 30 years. And let me, as Dean, I have to give some bragging rights. I have bragging rights about the school. So let me tell you some of the great things about the school. So I want to welcome our audience in here in the room, but I also want to welcome our audience at home or your office. So one, I am now the longest currently serving dean in the state of Texas. I've been dean for in my 12th year. The law school is a great institution. For those who are at home or in your office, you should see our building. It's a $93 million building, the state-of-the-art building. It has made the cover of Pre-Law magazine as one of the best law school buildings in the country. Our students are amazing students. They're really very smart and talented and they overcome a lot of different obstacles to be as successful as they are. And they are, the median LSAT for our students this past year entering class was a median of 163, and our median GPA was almost 3.8. So it's the highest median LSAT and GPA we've had in the law school's history. But at the same time, our students are from every background. About 25% are first-generation college students, and 85% are first-generation law school students. So it's students who have a lot of smarts, but are also very ambitious, and we're very proud of all their accomplishments. We're also very well ranked in many specialty rankings. We have 10 specialty rankings in the top 50. We have 4 in the top 15. Our part-time program is ranked number 5 in the nation. Our health law program is ranked number 9 in the nation, and social property number 12 in the nation. Our legal writing program number 15 in the nation. And our faculty are amazing, very, very smart, many of them, and very accomplished scholars and teachers. Many of them are members of the American Law Institute, which is one of the most prestigious organizations of judges, lawyers, and law professors in the nation. They write regularly in top 30 law reviews and journals. They are also, at the same time, incredibly empathetic and passionate teachers. And so they really work with our students to make sure that the students do as well as they possibly can. And the school's always been a place where our students have opportunity to pursue their dreams, even dreams that they may not have known of when they were a law school student. But this law school makes sure that every student can be as successful as they want to be. So as I mentioned, thank you to the Frankel family and this lecture. Thank you to the Law Review for organizing. We're very proud of all our students, but I think our Law Review specifically in this case do an amazing job of over 30 years stewarding this really great conversation on difficult issues. And the other thing about the law school is that we are here to discuss complicated, difficult issues, because part of the thing about a university or law school is that it has conversations that inform the public about different and complicated issues. As I like to say, our conversations provide light but not heat on any subject, and that's what we're aiming to do today. And I'm really excited to hear about this conversation with these leaders in the field. I would like to now introduce Assistant Dean and Professor of Law Emily Berman, who's the moderator of this session. Emily is the Assistant Dean for Faculty Research. We started at the same time 11 years ago now. We're both in our 12th year here, and we're very proud of all her accomplishments. She's an incredible scholar, great teacher, and she was a representative, I think, of the great faculty we have at the University of Houston Law Center. So let's now welcome Professor and Dean Emily Berman.
Thanks so much, Len. So good morning. Let me be the second person to welcome you here, those of you in the room, as well as those of you online, to the 2025 Frankel Lecture. So as you all know, we are currently in the midst of a government shutdown. And the current sticking point is an argument over what role the government should play in making healthcare broadly accessible to Americans across socioeconomic groups. Now, there is, I think, a nearly inexhaustible list of issues on which Democrats disagree with the current administration. And yet, this is the hill that they picked to die on, the attempt by the federal government to roll back federal health care benefits. And so I think this shutdown fight is emblematic of sort of the fundamental debate that's been going on for decades now in America, a long-running debate about the appropriate size and shape of the social safety net. So given the situation, the 2025 Frankel Lecture, which is entitled COVID and the Great Retrenchment, simply could not be more timely. In it, we're going to hear about the country's COVID-era rapid movement toward more universal benefits through expanded tax credits and unemployment insurance, things like that, and ask why those gains proved to be relatively short-lived. After all, political scientists have long argued that once people receive government benefits, they fight very hard to keep them. Beneficiaries become constituents, and politicians worry about backlash if they take benefits away. Yet this theory failed to predict what happened after COVID. And the question is why? And more broadly, the questions are, what does this moment tell us about the viability of building a more generous, more universal social welfare state in America, about the balance of power between workers and employers, about how political meanings get constructed and contested. These are not mere technical discussions about specific policy design. They're really fundamental questions about what kind of country we want to be. And to help us think through these questions today, we have three extraordinary scholars. Our lecturer today is Sam Bagenstos, the Frank G. Millard Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, and the Arlene Susan Cohn Professor of Social Policy at Michigan's School of Public Policy. He has spent his career as one of the leading voices on disability rights and social welfare policy, and his scholarship has really shaped how we understand the relationship between law, disability, and citizenship. Professor Bagenstos literally had a front row seat to the events about which he will be speaking. From 2021 to 2024, he served in the Biden administration, first as general counsel to the Office of Management and Budget, and then as general counsel in the Department of Health and Human Services, which means that he was in the room where many of these COVID-era policies were designed and implemented. So perhaps more than anyone else in the legal academy, he's positioned to enlighten us on these topics. Then responding to the lecture will first be Professor Abigail Moncrief, Associate Professor of Law and Political Science, and co-director of the Center for Health, Law, and Policy at Cleveland State University's College of Law. Her scholarship addresses legal, political, and social issues at this intersection of health and constitutional law. And she approaches today's topics through, I think, provocative theoretical lens, grounded in John Stewart and Harriet Taylor Mill's harm principle. And her account centers on the role of observable costs and uncertain benefits in the post-COVID retrenchment story. Then we'll hear from our second respondent, Professor Andrew Hammond, who's Professor of Law and Harry T. Ice Faculty Fellow at Indiana University's Maurer School of Law. Professor Hammond brings a different lens, one informed by his research on federalism, administrative law, and the implementation of welfare programs. He'll push us to think about the role of institutional design and how the fragmented, devolved nature of American federalism impacts efforts to expand the welfare state. The three scholars are going to offer genuinely different diagnoses of what happened. And as you'll see, they also offer different lessons about how to move forward. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So here's the plan for the event. Professor Bagenstos will deliver the lecture. We will then have brief responses from the two respondents. Then I will moderate a conversation first, beginning with some additional thoughts from our speakers and then opening the floor up to Q&A. So keep track of your questions as they arise. So on behalf of the Frankel Foundation, the Houston Law Review, and the University of Houston Law Center, thank you for being part of the conversation. And please join me in welcoming Professor Sam Bagenstos.
See if there's a way to have this stand up. Can you all hear me? Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you to Dean Baines and Dean Berman for those incredible introductions, and thank you as well to the University of Houston Law Review for inviting me to present this lecture and for doing such a great job in putting this together and hosting it. The three of us on the panel were talking last night about the way this event has come together, and we all participate in a lot of events organized often by students, often by faculty, often by staff. And I think from all of our perspectives, this is the best put together event that we have been to in many, many years. And it's really a credit to the University of Houston Law Review, to Isabel Rodriguez, who's been our point of contact, but to so many others of you. So thank you all for that. And I was incredibly honored to get the invitation. Some amazing scholars have given this lecture in the past, and I'm sorry, I'll lower their standards a little bit, so it'll make it easier for next year. But the invitation came at a particularly propitious or interesting time to be discussing issues of social welfare law and policy, because not only is it incredibly timely at the moment that we're speaking, something we couldn't quite have predicted. But in general, we have been at a moment where there are so many things happening in American politics and in the politics of American social welfare policy. So over the past 6 years, starting with the COVID pandemic, which came to the United States in 2019, at the end of 2019, we have seen at least two dramatic and really stunning shifts in federal social policy, federal healthcare policy, federal benefits policy. First, during the depths of the COVID pandemic, the government dramatically expanded a variety of public benefits, including support for income, food, housing, and healthcare. And many of these expansions were framed in explicitly universalistic terms, so moving towards covering everyone, regardless of their wealth, prior income, other indicia of need, other work, or other things they'd done to supposedly deserve those benefits. Many others of these programs broadened existing programs in a way that moved toward universalism, and these expansions had incredibly positive effects. Those who received the benefits were largely satisfied with them. But nonetheless, the dramatic expansion of these benefits was followed very quickly by the second stunning shift, which was, after a relatively short time, Congress rolled back nearly all of the benefits expansions. So I quote in the paper that will be published along with this, Andrew Hammond, along with his co-authors, who said that the COVID-19 pandemic seemed to herald lasting reform of U.S. safety net programs, but the permanent change that many predicted never materialized. But it's even worse than that. The immediate pullback from the COVID-19 expansion set the stage for an even more significant retrenchment in the second Trump administration, where in 2023, the United States came the closest it had ever been to universal health care with a record low uninsured rate of 7.7%. The Trump administration's Medicaid cuts, and if it fails to extend the Obamacare subsidies, which is the fight that's going on right now, will have wiped out essentially all of the gains that we have made since the adoption of the Affordable Care Act. So dramatic expansion of healthcare since 2010 might be entirely wiped away. And the Trump administration's reconciliation legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA, seems to have in particular eliminated the aspiration that healthcare is or should be a universal right. The OBBBA's Medicaid provisions rest on the premise that healthcare is something that people should earn by their individual contributions to society and the economy, which is the precise opposite of the incipient or imminent universalism of the COVID-era programs and of the avowed ultimate goal that informed the drafting and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. From Medicare and Medicaid through the Affordable Care Act to the COVID expansions, we had been moving to a place where healthcare was a right. Now we seem to be moving back to the precepts of the English Poor Laws from, going back to the 17th century and earlier. Those laws were based on the principle that basic health care and subsistence must be withheld from people who do not contribute to societal productivity, and that we must closely regulate the actions of those who receive public assistance to ensure that they contribute. That's a change that doesn't just roll back past expansions, but it threatens core premises that have informed healthcare and other benefits policy since the Great Society of the 1960s. So really going back not just to 2010, but in significant ways in terms of the goals, going back more than 60 years. That's not what the drafters of the COVID-era expansion thought would happen. They thought people would come to rely on and appreciate the new benefits, and then that reliance and appreciation would lead people to resist any efforts to roll them back, and would lead Congress, out of a fear of a popular backlash, to extend the expansions and eventually make them permanent. And the drafters of those expansions did not come to those ideas unthinkingly. Those ideas have informed the domestic policy agenda of the Democratic Party for many years now. They explicitly draw on a long line of work in political science that demonstrated, or seemed to demonstrate, was read to demonstrate, the durability of benefits expansions. In fact, the political science literature was more nuanced than that in ways that really matter here. But the Biden administration nonetheless could not muster the votes in Congress to make its COVID expansions permanent. And when the public seemed to tire of the COVID response and the Republicans took back both houses of Congress in the 2022 midterms, the administration acquiesced in rolling those expansions back significantly. The durability of benefits expansion theory did not predict such a quick reversal, nor did it predict the massive retrenchment ending decades of progress that built on the COVID rollbacks just a couple of years later in the second Trump administration. So as you heard from Dean Berman, I had a front row seat to those successive reversals. I saw how in the Biden administration, we dramatically expanded cash and health benefits, how we celebrated the record low uninsurance rate, and how as political support for these programs weakened, we let those great wins slip away. That experience left me looking for answers regarding why the political experts who thought that benefits expansion would be durable were so wrong, and answers regarding what lessons advocates of universal benefits might take from that experience. And in the remainder of this talk, I want to take a stab at those questions. From the COVID experience, we learned that universal benefits are not as politically durable as many Democratic Party policy circle folks believed, particularly benefits expansions in their earliest, most vulnerable years. And we saw clearly that because universal or more universal benefits tend to give workers more bargaining power vis-a-vis employers, employers have a strong political incentive to fight against benefits expansion that moves toward generosity and universalism. Expanded COVID-era benefits gave workers an exit option from unsafe, intolerable, or poorly compensated jobs, and many workers took that option, while many others merely threatened to take that option in an effort to obtain greater concessions from their employers. Business owners responded with anger and confusion when they saw a challenge to the hierarchy of the workplace, and they understood that they may have only a short time to keep the benefits that altered the bargaining relationship from becoming entrenched. And so they fought especially hard to squelch those new benefits early on. Opponents of universal benefits recognize that whether benefits are understood as universal is really not just an objective matter. It's a matter of social meaning. It's a meaning that can be subject to political contestation. And when they saw that the expansion of health and cash benefits threatened their bargaining power vis-a-vis their workers, employers had a strong interest in describing those expansions not as creating new universal protections, but as temporary compassionate aid for people who were deserving and going through hard times. They could then argue that allowing the expansions to continue was stretching the programs beyond that purpose and extending benefits to those who were no longer deserving. Unfortunately, from my perspective, they were so successful that they not only reversed the COVID-era gains, but also provided the expressed policy basis for the even broader retrenchment that was affected and has been affected and is in the middle of being affected by the Trump administration. And that leads to my last point. Those who thought that COVID-era expansions would be durable relied on a particular story that drew on decades of work in political science. New policies make new politics. New benefits in particular create constituencies for those benefits, and those constituencies resist rollbacks. But the COVID experience shows that this story misses some important points. It treats the costs imposed by expansion of benefits as diffused, basically taxes we all pay. It thus ignores the way that powerful economic actors can see new benefits programs as a particular focused threat to their economic and workplace hegemony. And that was a view that employers expressed and acted on during the COVID benefits expansion. The policies make politics story also ignores the need to build up the political power of those with an interest in defending benefits expansions. Beneficiaries may have an incentive to defend benefits expansions, but the COVID experience raises serious questions regarding whether those expansions can be durable if we do not first attend to imbalances of political power. All right, so let me, in the next 18 minutes, just say a little bit more underlying what I just said. So, first of all, let me talk about the COVID era benefits expansions. So there were many programs that were initiated and expanded during the depths of the COVID pandemic in a series of major bills. What I want to focus on are the ones that provided benefits to individuals, particularly the ones that provided benefits to individuals that moved toward a sense of universalism. So move toward everybody getting benefits, or nearly everybody, lots of people getting benefits, individuals getting those benefits directly, and getting those benefits not because of work they'd done, not because they were particularly deserving, but because they were people and people got benefits. So what were these? Well, there was the child tax credit, which was dramatically expanded during COVID by Congress, and not just dramatically expanded, but also made fully refundable so that people who did not earn enough to pay income taxes could be receiving the child tax credit. This is something that has been on the policy agenda of left of center folks in Washington for a very long time. They seized the opportunity of the COVID pandemic to make an expansion of the child tax credit, and the effects of that expansion were immediate. Child poverty fell by 46% from 9.7% in the relevant measure in 2020 to 5.2%, the lowest level ever recorded. Child poverty of 5.2%, the lowest level ever recorded in 2021. So basically, child poverty cut in half in a year. In addition, there's good evidence that that drop in poverty improved the health status of people who received the new child tax credit, and that it did not create work disincentives. The overwhelming majority of recipients spent their payment on their most basic needs: food, clothing, rent, a mortgage, utility bills. There was also, for childless adults who were in the working poor, an expansion of the earned income tax credit, which also was made fully refundable and did not have any minimum income threshold. And once again, that had significant positive effects on the lives of those who received it. And so again, with this two-pronged set of tax incentives. Third, the so-called stimulus payments, the economic impact payments. 3 checks went out. One, $1,200 per adult and $500 per child. 2, $600 per adult and $600 per child. And 3, the last one in March of 2021, $1,400 per adult and $1,400 per child. Again, Congress didn't set a minimum income threshold for these payments. They just went out to everyone making less than $75,000 for an individual or $150,000 per couple. The federal government set up a series of administrative efforts to help people who didn't pay taxes get these benefits. And in the end, this looked a lot like, and commenters suggested it looked a lot like, an incipient universal basic income program. The vast majority of Americans received these stimulus checks, $75,000 for an individual, $150,000 for a couple, nets in pretty much the majority of Americans. And this seemed to have a very substantial effect on reducing poverty. The first 2 rounds of the stimulus lifted 11.7 million people out of poverty. And as many people thought at the time, this might be a moment when we move toward more basic income programs. There were also expanded unemployment insurance programs, a very brief paid family and medical leave program that applied to a slice of employees. And then the last piece I'll talk about, expanded healthcare. Congress did 2 very significant things during the pandemic to expand healthcare. One is Congress gave states extra money for their Medicaid program on the condition that they not remove anybody from the Medicaid rolls during the pandemic. Okay, so that so-called continuous enrollment provision led to 23 million more people being enrolled in Medicaid and CHIP, which is a related program, by March 2023 than before the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan Act, the signature kind of stimulus bill of President Biden in early 2021, also provided subsidies to individuals who purchase insurance on the Obamacare exchanges. That's the thing that's being fought about right now in the politics of the shutdown. These benefits expansions were originally set to expire, or these subsidy expansions were originally set to expire in 2022. Congress in the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 extended them to 2025, which is why we're fighting about it right now. And as a result of these expansions, the number of people with Affordable Care Act marketplace coverage increased almost doubled. It increased from 11.4 million to 21.4 million between 2020 and 2024. By the end of 2024, HHS was reporting that 24 million people were receiving Affordable Care Act coverage. So we had dramatic expansions of both cash benefits and health care. Those expansions cut child poverty in half. They lifted over 10 million people out of poverty. They led to the lowest uninsurance rate that we have ever seen in the United States, 7.7%. This was dramatic proof of concept of what an expanded set of cash benefits could do. Then, almost as quickly as the expansion began, the federal government pulled back. By mid-2021, the retrenchment was well underway. And by the end of the Biden administration, nearly all of the benefits expansions had been reversed. The only one really left was the Obamacare subsidies, which we're fighting about right now. And the second Trump administration went even further, to the degree that it has not just taken back COVID-era protections, but is also threatening to roll back healthcare significantly, both in what it already did in the OBBBA and in this current fight. So how did that happen? So when the expanded child tax credit came up for renewal at the end of 2021, many people believed, and President Biden proposed, that it should be renewed for multiple years, if not permanently. Many Democrats, who were the folks who crafted the child tax credit proposal originally, thought it would easily get extended. But no. Senator Joe Manchin, who was at that point the pivotal vote in a 50-50 Senate, objected to any extension of the child tax credit, and Congress allowed the expansion to end at the end of 2021. And the results were child poverty had been cut in half, child poverty bounced back to where it was before. Congress ended the economic income payments, the stimulus payments, and refused to adopt legislation to create automatic payments in the future should the economy fall in a significant way. Congress terminated the unemployment expansion, actually moved to do that very quickly. About half the states had abandoned that by mid-2021, and Congress ended it by the end of 2021. Congress let the paid family and medical leave lapse. And Congress in 2023 adopted a law saying that the Medicaid continuous enrollment provision that had increased the number of people receiving Medicaid by 23 million had to end, and that states had to start kicking people off their Medicaid programs again. By the end of that process, over 25 million people were disenrolled from Medicaid. So that was about a third of people, little under a third of people on state Medicaid programs were kicked off. Of those 23 million, about 4 million were able to get health care on the Obamacare exchanges, in part thanks to the tax credits, which we're currently fighting over. And let me tell you how important those tax credits are. Of the 24 million people who are receiving health care on the Obamacare exchanges, 24 million people, 22 million of those people receive these expanded subsidies. If the subsidies go away, then what we are going to have is a very significant reduction in healthcare in this country. Okay. So whereas in 2023 we were as close as we ever were to universal healthcare, now we're quite a lot farther away from that. So why? Why did this happen? Well, it's especially worth exploring that in light of what the Trump administration has done. Between the enactment of the OBBBA, their attempts to fail to extend the subsidies, although we'll see what happens with that, and related administrative actions, the Trump administration has done much more than simply roll back COVID-era policies. It's reversed the bulk of the expansion of health insurance availability since the Affordable Care Act. Where healthcare had been looking like a right, or at least heading in that direction, it's now heading in a very different direction. So why is this? I suggest a few things. Number one is the threat of benefits expansions to the bargaining power of employers. So one of the things we saw during COVID and with the COVID era benefits expansions was the so-called Great Resignation, where people around the country seem to be leaving their jobs voluntarily. And why? And the people who are leaving the jobs voluntarily, yes, the stories in the Wall Street Journal and in other outlets focused a lot on sort of creative class people, upper middle class people, but the bulk of the people who were leaving jobs in service industries where the pay was comparatively low and the working conditions were comparatively bad. What people were doing was voting with their feet to say, these jobs are intolerable, and if I have an exit option, I'm going to exercise it. Many employees joined in unions for the first time and went on strike in significant numbers, the so-called Striketober of 2021. And other employees went to their employers and said, we're thinking of leaving if you don't give me a better deal. And so you saw workplaces start to improve their wages, improve their working conditions. And the anger expressed in and out of legislative hearings around extending the COVID era benefits expansions highlights the reaction of employers. That employers in the large groups that represent employers like the NFIB decided that this was a threat to their ability to run the workplace and their ability to obtain the best deal with regard to their employees, that the shift in bargaining power mattered to them. And so they fought hard against the expansions. The theory that when people get expanded benefits, they'll be happy about them, and therefore they will fight any effort to undo them, needs to account for the power relationships and not just not just what people want, what people like. And when large economic interests perceive a very focused threat to their economic interests, they're likely to fight against these benefits expansions. That's one lesson. Another lesson is about how benefits expansions are understood. Many of the Democrats who crafted these benefits expansions saw them as moving toward healthcare as a right, moving toward universal benefits, a broader child tax credit for everyone for all time. But they weren't the only ones who got a say in how these policies would be perceived. They thought people would receive these policies and think, yes, this is good. This is something I'm entitled to. But of course, there was another group of people, the people who were opposed to these expansions, who were telling a story about it as well. And it was a story that also fit what the policies looked like. It was a story of temporary expansion in order to provide for people with particular needs. And the idea that benefits should be temporary and go to people who are particularly deserving, whether because of some act of God like a pandemic or something else, is an idea that has a very, very long pedigree in American law and society, in Anglo-American law and society. And so it's not surprising that these arguments were resonant. In fact, when Congress amended the welfare laws to make a dramatic change in 1996 in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, PERWORA, otherwise known as the Clinton Welfare Reform Law, it reoriented welfare laws along that line. It almost reoriented healthcare law along that line. There was, for much of the legislative process, the understanding that Medicaid would be folded in to the idea of a temporary assistance plan that only was abandoned at the last minute. And in part, it was abandoned because too many people thought of healthcare as something different than cash benefits. Healthcare is something more approaching a right. But the people who wanted to think of healthcare for poor people as welfare never gave up the fight. And you saw in the fight to promote Medicaid unwinding, to end the Medicaid continuous enrollment provision in 2023, the continued repeated statements by the opponents of the Medicaid expansion that what has happened here under COVID is moving Medicaid from something that it always should have been, which is a short-term helping hand to people in need, to something that is looking more like a right, which we reject. And it was that understanding of Medicaid that not only underlay the rollback of the COVID era expansions in 2023, but also was the express justification of the Trump administration and its supporters in Congress for the dramatic cuts to Medicaid under the OBBBA. Those cuts were made largely under the guise of imposing work requirements. Those work requirements, in fact, have been shown again and again and again not to promote work, but instead simply to knock people out of the rolls. But the justification given for them was that Medicaid is welfare, and welfare should be a temporary hand up, not a permanent handout, even when it takes the form of basic medical care. And one of the problems of the Democrats' COVID expansion is they assumed the policies would speak for themselves, that they did not have to engage in any active framing of those policies. And I think what we see from the COVID era expansions and their quick retrenchment is that those policies needed not just an advocate, but somebody helping to construct them, somebody helping to make the case for why they were properly a move toward a right to health care, why they were properly a move toward universal benefits. The absence of an effort to frame those expansions in that way and the assumption the policies would speak for themselves is one of the negative lessons that people like me who advocate broader expansions will take from the COVID era experience. And then finally, last point before I conclude, the need in thinking about how to craft expanded benefits programs to think not just about the power of the people on the other side, but how to expand the power of the people who are receiving those benefits. Again, the implicit political theory of the folks who crafted the COVID era benefits expansions was, well, if there are a lot of voters who are going to get something taken away from them, they will have the strength to resist. And it turns out just having a lot of voters is not enough to exercise power in our separation of powers system. You need to be thinking about how to isolate and strengthen that power. And so a lot of people would say a lesson of the COVID experience is, particularly if the problem was employers saw too great labor power being created by these benefits programs, and so they acted quickly to squelch those programs so that the labor power would not rise up. A lot of people would say, well, we need to think about first expanding labor power. As I argue in the piece that will be published from this, I do not think that's the right sequencing. I think you have to be opportunistic and do both at once. And in the course of a pandemic, when people are hurting right now, they need to be provided with what they need. But perhaps instead of thinking presumptively that if you provide benefits for a year, they will necessarily be extended because people will resist having them taken away, and therefore providing lots of benefits on a short-term basis, hoping that they'll all get extended. If the choice, because of budgeting constraints, is lots of benefits on a short-term basis or a smaller number on a long-term basis, maybe focus on the smaller number, and maybe focus at the same time on creating structures under which beneficiaries and workers in particular can exercise their power. So one question is, what do we do with all this? We had a dramatic expansion of federal benefits programs, a dramatic expansion of healthcare, and then a dramatic retrenchment. I think this calls into question a standard story that when people receive benefits, they fight to keep them. I think we need to attend to issues of power, and we need to attend to issues of the construction of social meaning. But it's also true that we live in a polarized political environment where every election is incredibly close, and where perhaps the old rules of politics and political science do not apply in the same way. The mechanisms that once promoted entrenchment of benefits expansion just may not have the power they once did. And so perhaps advocates of reforms need to be thinking not just in terms of the particular policy space of benefits and healthcare, but more general reforms to our political system so that we can be providing durable benefits to working people in the future. I think there are lessons to take even if we don't do that, but perhaps the bigger lesson is that the task is much bigger than any of us can even contemplate confronting. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. I'm really looking forward to the responses from Abby and Andrew, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Abby. So I used to have this riff in class about how Republicans are so much better than Democrats at naming stuff. It's like the biggest piece of legislation that the Republicans had passed in recent memory was the Patriot Act, which I don't know if you know is an acronym. USA Patriot Act stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act, which is like the most magnificently named statute I've ever come across. And then the Democrats come along and they pass the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, PPACA. They give the entire country a stutter. And the Republicans, because they can't help themselves, are like, ew, Obamacare. And I'm like, hey, that's a pretty good name. So adopt Obamacare as the name. And then Trump ruined it by passing the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is the lamest name I've ever heard of a statute. So my riff is over, but I, as by way of thinking through healthcare legislation and how it functions, we have two statutes now that are both poorly named, one from each side: Obamacare expanding benefits, OBBBA taking them back. And so Sam offers us some political policy-based explanations for why the standard story of stickiness when benefits are passed and extended didn't hold during the COVID era expansion. And I want to offer a completely different theoretical take that is not so much grounded in empirics and politics and policy and power, and is instead grounded in a political theory that is squishier, softer, more intuitive, but I think interesting and compelling. Maybe wrong, but I like it. So it's grounded in John Stuart and Harriet Taylor Mill's treatise on liberty. Most people understand, by the way, Harriet Taylor Mill co-authored On Liberty. John Stuart Mill told us so in his autobiography, and for no good reason, she was written out of history. I'm writing her back into history. So if I say the Mills, I'm still talking about On Liberty. So the Mills are best known for what we call their harm principle. And the idea that most of us take from, for a century and a half, that most of us have taken from On Liberty, is that government should intervene only to prevent interpersonal harms and should leave us free to harm ourselves. So if we're making decisions that impact only ourselves, government should leave us alone. If we're making decisions that impact each other, government might be able to intervene. I wrote a dissertation in my PhD program reinterpreting the harm principle as what I call an uncertainty principle. And so the idea that I take from On Liberty is not that government should intervene only when we are harming each other, but rather that government should intervene only when net harms of specific conduct are observable to outsiders, such that regulators can make a plausible case that they are correcting a harm through intervention. When net harms, however, are unobservable and thus uncertain, government should leave us alone. So the Mills give lots of examples in their treatise of what they claim to be unregulable conduct, but say are harmful. And some examples of self-harms that they say are regulable, which makes the whole harm principle just not fit the examples that they give us. But all of them fit better their uncertainty principle. So there's this line in the book, they say, it is easy for anyone to imagine an ideal public which leaves the freedom and choice of the individual in all uncertain matters undisturbed and forbids only that conduct which universal experience has condemned. So they very explicitly tell us their ideal line is between uncertainty and certainty, rather than between harm and, or interpersonal harm and self-harm. And then they provide all of these examples, including things like dancing in a Puritan society, where they say, if you're dancing, you're definitely harming the Puritans because the Puritans are scared that if they let you dance, they're gonna go to hell. And so there's a harm, but it's an uncertain net harm between the two parties. So like, does dancing give me enough joy to overcome the Puritans' fear of damnation is a completely unobservable question. Nobody can measure from the outside how much pleasure I get from dancing. Nobody can measure from the outside how much fear or pain the Puritans experience from their fear of damnation. And nobody actually knows whether the Puritans will end up in hell or not because we can't observe hell. And we can't interview the dead to find out whether hell sucks or not. So the principle that best explains and fits all of the Mills examples is this principle of uncertainty and unobservability. So I take from this in my dissertation, in a book I'm writing, in a whole series of articles, and briefly in the Houston Law Review paper that I wrote in response to Sam's lecture. I take from this a principle that government should leave us alone when regulators cannot observe net costs and benefits, but should freely intervene and regulate any of those things which society is competent to restrain, which are those things that give rise to observable, measurable, quantifiable costs and benefits. Usually when money is involved, regulate. When there's no money involved, don't regulate. But that's just a simple rule, that it's not perfect. And so the principle that the Mills articulate as applied to the COVID pandemic is not a causal story that I can tell with clarity as a political scientist, as an empiricist. But I think it has explanatory power for how publics react to governmental constraints. And so I think we see that in literature, in feeling, that when governments try to mind control us, thought police us, try to control aspects of us that the government can't observe and prove through observation, we rebel, we resist. That's the Orwellian nightmare. That's Big Brother. We don't like it. And when governments try to regulate very concrete, observable harms like murder, we're like, yeah, man, go, stop the murders. So I think that there's a pretty close fit, not directly because of the Mills, but just I think the Mills are describing an intuition that publics often feel, that we don't want to be regulated in our unobservable innermost feelings, but we're okay with being regulated in our outward conduct. So with respect to welfare benefits and entitlements and handouts, government handouts that help us out, sometimes some of those involve lots of observable costs and benefits. We can see somebody who's sick is sick. We can observe coughs and sneezes and sniffles and aches and pains to some extent through facial expressions. There are observable costs to being sick without healthcare. We can see somebody who is unhoused and dying of exposure on the street. We can see some of the costs of that situation. And a lot of the benefits are monetary and therefore have really direct, clear costs and benefits, costs to the government, benefits to the individual who's receiving the benefits. But there is widespread disagreement among Americans as to appropriate means of solving some of these problems. And that disagreement stems from a difference between those who believe that the harms of lack of medical care or the harms of homelessness are systemic and caused by something like capitalism or something like property rights protections, those people who think these harms are systemic want government to fix them. But people who believe that those harms derive from personal choices don't want government to fix them and instead want private charities or private decision-making or personal responsibility, as they called it in Clinton's Welfare Reform Act, to correct the problem of economic insecurity. And that is deeply consistent with an uncertainty principle kind of logic, where if you have made a series of choices to quit your secure job in order to start a business, which is a risk you might take that you know might lead to economic insecurity, if you've made a personal choice to discontinue your mental health medication and that causes you to become job insecure and end up being unhoused, if you make a choice to become addicted to a narcotic or an illegal drug that causes you to lose your job and become economically insecure, those are intrapersonal trade-offs. Those are choices you've made for yourself that government can't observe how much pleasure you derive from those choices. And even though they can observe the harms that follow, they don't know whether those harms were worth bearing to you as an individual. So I tend to be more on the systemic side. I'm a Democrat. I tend to think we should provide welfare benefits, but I can understand this kind of libertarian perspective that the costs of economic insecurity arise from individual choices rather than from systemic harms. And if that's true, then government might not be the best tool for trying to solve the problem, because we might not actually be helping people by getting them reemployed if they have made choices to become unemployed and derive enough pleasure from those choices to where they're going to resist efforts by the government to reemploy them or something along those lines, okay? So I think that kind of tracks the uncertainty principle. Now, sometimes a big disruption, an exogenous shock occurs that causes costs and benefits to become much more visible and observable to regulators. And so like the Great Depression is a great example of this kind of thing, where capital markets collapsed worldwide. It became implausible that anybody who was unemployed solely by choice. There were obvious systemic problems occurring that made unemployment skyrocket. COVID had the same effect. COVID is an exogenous shock that caused immediate quarantine, causing many businesses to shutter and many people to become unemployed, and shifted the story more in the direction of systemic harm rather than personal choice in terms of what was driving unemployment. But when the government fixes the problems arising from exogenous shocks in the context of a capital market failure, or in the context of, I use some 1960s examples from the Great Society as well, in the context of like the Kennedy assassination and the civil rights movement, it's correcting bad laws with better laws. But when it tries to correct those problems as they arise in a pandemic, the problems didn't arise from bad laws. So the Great Depression maybe arose because of the laissez-faire legal approach of the 1890s through 1920s. But you can't make the same argument about the pandemic. The pandemic wasn't caused by a set of bad choices by the Supreme Court or by Congress. Maybe the pandemic was caused by zoonotic transmission, maybe it was caused by a lab leak, nobody fully knows, but it certainly happened in China and not in the United States. So it's not possible to blame the US government and say, well, we can fix it through good laws. Plus, pandemics are complex systems. So I don't know how much you guys know about complex systems theory. That's like a physics thing. But the basic idea, and the common law is a complex system too, so you should learn about it if you don't know about it. So the basic theory of a complex system is that a bunch of individual choices give rise to, like disaggregated, uncoordinated individual choices, give rise to observable phenomena. But the causes of those phenomena cannot be traced to discrete antecedent choices. And so you have emergent phenomena, but you can't like reverse engineer them and figure out exactly which individual choice gave rise to the emergent phenomenon. So in a pandemic, we have lots of people dying, but it's literally impossible to trace each case of COVID back to a single transmission event. You can't do it. we tried contact tracing and it doesn't actually work. Like we can't figure out exactly which patient gave the virus to which other patients. And we can't figure out which individual wearing their mask badly caused a mass transmission event. So the pandemic is a problem that government has to tackle because it gives rise to observable problems. But it is one that is going to set the government up for failure because the government can't actually fix the underlying causes of the problems that are arising. So unlike problems that arise from legal failure, problems that arise from pandemic can't be fixed by government. So if I'm right that the uncertainty principle tracks, or sort of that the logic of the uncertainty principle roughly describes a political feeling that exists among most voters, then a pandemic is necessarily always going to undermine public faith in government because the government is going to be tackling an uncertain foe. The government is going to be trying to regulate something that it can't really regulate well under utilitarian theory. It's going to be producing certain costs through universal basic income and healthcare benefits, but it's going to be producing uncertain benefits because we don't know what causes the pandemic costs in the first place. We don't know whether the fixes that we've implemented are actually fixing the underlying causes. And so we're trading concrete costs for uncertain benefits in a way that makes most people uncomfortable when talking about government, I think. Again, theory. So then the retrenchment story that resonates for me, given the uncertainty principle, is that in a moment of pandemic, when government is sort of obligated to intervene, but is set up for failure, it will undermine public faith in government generally, and will cause a backlash against welfare states and against governmental regulation in ways that matter. I have no idea how much time I've been talking for or how much time I have left. Does anybody know? I would add one more thing if I have time to. Okay, so so the last thing I'll say is that when there is general agreement about the ends that we're trying to pursue, but widespread disagreement about the best means of implementing them, the optimal approach, in my view, is federalism, rather than either nationalism or individualism. The best approach is to let states experiment with different ways to correct the problem. Everybody agrees it's a problem that there are people sleeping on the street. Everybody agrees it's a problem that people are dying from treatable illnesses. But we're not quite sure how to fix it. We should let the states play and be able to use the variability in state approaches to figure out which means are providing the best outcomes. And so I'm glad that everybody let me add that because it is a nice alley-oop to Andrew, and I will hand it over to him.
Thanks so much, Abby. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate Dean Baines and Professor Berman, their introductions and their welcome. I also just really want to second, or third, I guess, the appreciation for the editors of the Houston Law Review. They've done an amazing job with this event, and I also just want to thank you for your future work editing, not just my paper, but Sam and Abby's as well. I also just want to say that it's really an inspired choice to invite Sam Bagensauce to give this lecture. He's a guiding light for a lot of attorneys and a lot of legal academics as it relates to disability law and social policy and public law more broadly. So it's a real thrill to be in conversation with him and Abby. I'm going to try in my time allotted to do four things. I want to kind of elaborate, reframe, complicate, and extend Sam's lecture. First, I want to elaborate how the legal and bureaucratic implementation of the COVID expansions undermined the kind of incipient universalist policies. Second, I want to reframe and maybe disaggregate Sam's characterization of these expansions. Third, I want to complicate his story of how COVID expansions gave way to our current moment. And finally, I want to extend Sam's analysis of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So the first is kind of elaborate on the policy feedback argument. I think you've heard enough to understand the basics of the argument, that there's this kind of virtuous cycle where policy makes new politics. But I think that it's really important to understand how these benefits were delivered during the COVID expansions. Policy feedback assumes a kind of straightforward transmission, but COVID relief really reached American households through a welfare state that is kind of famously fragmented, burdensome, and exclusionary. Congress can approve funds and legislate universalist policies, expanding eligibility, but generally state and local governments deliver these benefits. And Sam, in his paper, rightly so, kind of identifies a whole slew of policies. I think that his arguments are strongest as it relates to the child tax credit, the EITC, and the economic impact payments, the stimulus checks, or what my students used to call the stimmies. And incidentally, underlying his paper is really the role of the IRS and the Treasury Department and the kind of exquisite government data they had to roll that out. But he includes the pandemic unemployment assistance expansion, which I'm going to talk about. He doesn't talk about pandemic EBT, which was a really important expansion of food assistance, the SNAP program, to kids and families who are experiencing school closures. Let me tell you a little bit about the rollout of the pandemic unemployment assistance. So states like New York, Kentucky, Florida had a really tough time delivering the pandemic unemployment assistance. Sam acknowledges this in the paper. In my home state of New Jersey, they actually recommended that people call the Department of Labor either before 7 a.m. or after 10 p.m. so they could deal with the demand. When it related to pandemic EBT, this food assistance program for kids experiencing school closures, the idea was a lot of kids in this country get their breakfast and lunch at school, and what happens when you close schools? They're gonna go hungry. Tennessee started expanding these benefits to kids in families that were already receiving food stamps and SNAP, but they forgot to extend the program to kids who were eligible because they went to schools that were poor enough to be community eligible for the school meal program. So in other words, they just unevenly implemented this policy. It wasn't out of ill will, it was a new program and they weren't good at implementing it, but it impacted 400,000 kids in Tennessee. Florida's unemployment assistance insurance program basically broke down during this period. And Sam talks about the emergency rental assistance program in his paper, but 89% of those funds didn't reach renters for over a year into the pandemic. So there's a lot of uneven state implementation in these programs, in the COVID programs. There also was a lot of unwilling state implementation that I want to highlight. Texas famously opted out of the pandemic unemployment assistance before the funding expired. It forfeited $6.5 billion that would have come into the state. 1 million Texans saw their unemployment insurance go down, and 760,000 Texans saw their unemployment insurance eliminated, even though it looks like there was no impact on workforce participation, whether or not people were receiving this. Same with pandemic EBT. 12 states could have continued to receive additional food assistance to poor kids experiencing school closures, but they just said, we don't want the money, okay? So it's really important to understand that universal social policy in the United States is going to require 50 states, 5 territories, hundreds of federally recognized tribes, not to mention local governments, to kind of row together. And I think that the history of American social policy, indeed the history of the Affordable Care Act Medicaid expansion, should suggest that they're not going to all row in the same direction and they might not arrive at the destination. Okay, second thing, I want to reframe the expansions that Sam talks about and distinguish between the first pandemic deal, which was the 116th Congress and President Trump, and the second pandemic deal of the 117th Congress and President Biden, just as historians refer to the first New Deal and the second New Deal. These were both crises-driven bargains, and I don't see them necessarily as a coherent march toward universalism. So the first pandemic deal, I think, is actually better to be understood as macroeconomic stabilizers. It was really that members of Congress and the Trump administration recognized that they were in an election year in 2020. More Americans lost their jobs in that year than in any year since 1939. And members of Congress were worried they would lose their jobs if they didn't act forcefully and swiftly. And so a lot of the programs that Sam's alluding to actually come out of that Congress. The stimulus checks, or at least the first two, I believe, the continuous enrollment provision under the Families First legislation. So I don't think that members of Congress were upset that the child poverty rates went down, but I don't think that they were actually focused on that. What they were really trying to do was avert the problems of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA, the 2009 legislation responding to the financial crisis that a lot of people thought was too small to make a significant macroeconomic impact. So Sam's account, I think, really is on stronger ground when it relates to the American Rescue Plan, which is part of the second pandemic deal. I include ARPA, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and the relevant Inflation Reduction Act provisions that Sam mentioned in his talk. But I think even though they were more ambitious than the first pandemic deal and really focused on the costs of care, they were limited by the reconciliation and appropriation processes and the kind of anti-majoritarian procedures in the Senate. So I think disaggregation actually helps explain why these expansions proved less durable. And I think we risk misreading the intent of President Biden and the 117th Congress back into the Trump administration and the 116th Congress. So I kind of agree with him that the expansions were extraordinary in scale, but I think they were conventional in aim. They were really much more focused on propping up consumer confidence and markets as opposed to building a universal welfare state. Okay, third, let me complicate the story about how ARPA led to the OBBBA. So Sam's story is saying, like, we need to focus on the business backlash that in the 2024 election and the social meaning. I think those are plausible stories. I generally am reluctant to tie kind of national electoral results to a single policy domain, but I want to give you a historical analog, which is to compare the 2024 election to the 1936 election. So the 1936 election was arguably the first election where the New Deal was on the ballot. President Roosevelt was facing re-election. His congressional allies were facing re-election in the House and a third of them in the Senate. And the 1936 election appeared to be a kind of resounding affirmation of President Roosevelt's domestic agenda. And historians talk about it this way. But some new political science research has come to light by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. They've written some papers about this, and it's in a great book called Democracy for Realists that I would recommend. Ezra Klein blurbed the book, and he said something like, this is like telling people who believe in politics there is no Santa. I think you should check it out. Basically, Aiken and Bartels show that the 1936 election was not a ringing endorsement of New Deal policies. It was that voters in the fall of 1936 felt like they had more money in their wallets and in their pocketbooks. Basically, there were slightly better economic conditions, and so they were willing to stick with FDR. Compare that to 2024. President Biden was facing opposite dynamics. There was inflation that we really haven't seen in decades. There was the war, supply chain issues, the war in Russia, or the war from Russia's invasion of Ukraine was contributing to the inflation issues. And so there was actually real wage decline. Wages really failed to keep pace with prices in the United States. And so I think that story, more than business backlash, is likely to explain why President Biden's party was punished at the polls. I also think we should just keep in mind that 4 years of relief can't really meaningfully blunt the affordability crises in housing and higher education, in childcare and healthcare that have built up over the last 50 years. So there's just a huge hole dug by wage stagnation since the 1970s. And when you combine that with inflation, I think it's a very different electoral story than what we might have seen from 1936. I also don't see OBBBA as a kind of reaction to President Biden's policies. I just see it as a continuation of President Trump's first term. There were efforts to meaningfully cut back and retrench Medicaid and SNAP during President Trump's first term. This was actually identified by then Speaker Paul Ryan as his big priority. He said, I want to do welfare reform 2.0. He said in public, I've been dreaming of doing this since I was drinking out of a keg as a congressional intern. And so I think if you look at what the President Trump was trying to do in the first term, OBBA looks a lot like that policy agenda. They couldn't do it through statute in the first term, so they tried to do it administratively, and now they have a more cohesive party caucus on Capitol Hill. So my final point is I just want to extend Sam's account of the OBBBA. I really do think it is kind of era-defining retrenchment for one of the reasons I just mentioned. They've been able, the members of Congress and the congressional majorities and President Trump have been able to basically legislate, to codify the architecture of increased conditionality in these programs. It's going to be a lot harder to fight them in the courts. I've written about this before, focusing on non-custodial parents, childless adults, immigrant families. I also think that it's an example of systemic retrenchment. So building on the political science literature and retrenchment, the fact that OBBBA makes the 2017 tax cuts permanent is going to make it incredibly hard to rebuild the welfare state in the years to come. So I agree with Sam that this legislation really sets the terms of social policy for years to come, although I'm trying to give you some additional reasons. So while I think that welfare state expansion and retrenchment, just to wrap up, are best understood together, I'm less inclined to kind of read causation into that relationship or a backlash story, and I'm less inclined to think of them as kind of aberrations, but really as recurring features of our welfare state. I don't think that recognition should make us complacent, but I think it should remind us that the work of sustaining social provision in the years to come is always going to be contested and incomplete and shaped by law. So I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks to all three of you for starting off a really interesting conversation. I guess I want to start by asking Sam if you would like to respond to any of the responses.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So thanks. Yeah, and I really appreciated the comments from both Abby and Andrew. So let me say a couple of things about the comments. I mean, one overarching point is, I actually agree with an enormous amount of the analysis that both Abby and Andrew provided, in the sense that I don't purport to be offering, or I shouldn't be, and I will make sure not to, I don't purport to be offering a monocausal explanation of what happened, or even particularly an electoral explanation of what happened here. I think it's absolutely right and fully consistent with my argument that there are a series of competing, whether they're political or theoretical, undercurrents within American politics and American society, right? So it has been the case since the beginning of the United States that there is a set of sort of solidaristic communitarian ideas about social welfare policy that has competed with a set of libertarian choice-based ideas, that there's always been this notion of a deserving and undeserving poor, and there's always been a critique of this notion. And the history of American social policy is really, one way of talking about it is it's about these competing tendencies fighting for superiority, and different ones taking precedence at different times and in different policy areas for different durations. So I think that a lot of what both Abby and Andrew are saying is fully consistent with that and sort of emphasizing that piece of it. Whereas what I'm emphasizing is here is a particular moment where we're seeing in real time one of the longstanding competing views, and you could obviously make it much more complicated and have lots of competing views within that, but to simplify, one of the two longstanding competing views of American social policy kind of winning a big fight in a way that I think really is era defining. And I think, as Abby points out, it's no surprise that that happened in the wake of COVID. I think that I'm not sure you need to get to Mill and an uncertainty principle to say that what happened in COVID, both inherently and in the specifics of how governments in the United States and around the world specifically responded to COVID, did diminish public trust in government. And that when you have diminished public trust in government, you tend to move in a more conservative direction. And so I think that's absolutely true. I think I would say I think there are some very good points that Andrew makes about disaggregation. And I would definitely say the stimulus and CTC points are particularly strong in terms of the story I would like to tell. I actually think the healthcare story, is a very important one as well. And part of maybe what our difference is that I think Andrew's general point that we ought not to attribute a single cause to any particular policy outcome is totally right. And I would say there's an analytically similar point to we ought not to attribute any particular intent to a piece of legislation. So I would really reject the idea that in the 2020 Congress, there was a particular goal of immediate stimulus. And in the 2021 Congress, there was a particular goal of expanding the welfare state. I actually think both were competing in both. And I think if you look in particular at the people who insisted on the child tax credit idea being in the bill in 2020, because after all, it did not get extended in 2021. If you look at what those people said, it was very clear. I mean, if you look, it's a fascinating experience, the construction of each of the major COVID response bills. That if you read, we were talking about Barbara Sinclair's book, Unorthodox Lawmaking earlier, which is a great book about how Congress works. I think she overestimates, so she basically says, look, we don't do committees anymore. Everything is done in the leadership suites. So all the things you've learned about how Congress works are wrong. What she overstates is how many of the ideas actually come from the leadership suites in Congress. In fact, each of the major coronavirus response bills, both in 2020 and in 2021, and even through to the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which had some COVID response in it, they all were vehicles for entrepreneurial members of Congress who often had been working for years on particular policy ideas that were their bugaboos to say, aha, this is the moment I can get this into the bill. And the folks who put child tax credit in particular into the bill very much had the idea, this is the moment we can score our historic win on child tax credit. They had been pursuing standalone bills for a long time. They continue to do so. But they thought, well, if we do it now, that will be durable. There were other people who are like, well, look, you're going to do it now for a year and I'm going to come back and fight you on it. And, obviously Joe Manchin, who turns out to be the crucial player here, was one of them. And I think the folks who expected to have durable expansions had, what on the internet they would call an underpants gnome idea of the politics of dealing with Joe Manchin, which is, the crucial term is question mark, question mark, question mark, and then the next point is profit. Like, well, what are we going to do? We're going to present it to Joe Manchin, and then question mark, question mark, question mark, and he'll just say yes to it, even though he said no forever. Like there was no theory about how to put pressure on a majority within the Senate to make it work. But I think they nonetheless had this view that once it was in place for a year, it'd be there forever. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to speak to is those folks who are very dominant within the kind of Democratic Party policy wonk class, who have this very strong view that policies make politics, and so we just need to get these rules in place and then they'll stay there forever. Something they believed was underscored and proven by the inability of the first Trump administration to get rid of Obamacare and to impose restrictions on Medicaid, right? They thought, aha, this proves to us that once these policies are in place, they'll be there forever. Well, I think what they have to learn is know that there are ways in which these can get undermined, and that even when Paul Ryan thinks he's lost in one battle, he will come back to fight again, because these are enduring divides within American social policy. And so it's important to be engaging on the terrain, not just of assuming that once things are in place, they'll stay in place, but of how to construct the power relations to ensure that they'll stay in place if that's what you want. And then the last thing I'll talk about is federalism, because you both talked about federalism in different ways and with different spins. You know, my basic view about federalism is I think federalism has an incredibly important role in various aspects of policy implementation, both because you have policy implementation being made by folks who are closer to the people being affected, and sort of a principle of subsidiarity makes some sense just in terms of having efficient public services, and because we may have value differences that we might want to give some birth to, and federalism can be a convenient way of doing that. But I think that, as Andrew shows, both the COVID experience and the experience of social welfare policies in particular, where money is at stake, not talking about regulation and particularly social regulation, but social welfare policies where money is at stake, shows the limits of relying on states for implementation. So the policies that were most successful in the COVID response were the federal policies, were the policies at the central government, imposed by and implemented by the central government, the ones that were implemented by the Department of Treasury. And that was in part because they were very simple, but also because, you know, we know that the public sector at the state level gets hollowed out because of interjurisdictional competition. That was one of the basic lessons of the New Deal, but the New Deal also kept a significant state implementation apparatus in place because the politics were such that they could bring the fiscal part of a lot of social programs to the federal level, but they had to keep implementation at a state level. And I think what we're seeing is that even the implementation gets undercut by the hollowing out of the state apparatus at the state level, which is in part due to interjurisdictional competition. And so one response I think we have to think about is how we get a lot more of the implementation of largesse programs to be at the federal level, while at the same time retaining the benefits of federalism, which I actually think is one of the hardest questions that we confront in the new Trump era of politics. So thanks so much for these comments. Super interesting, super generative, and really looking forward to further discussion.
All right, let's open the floor to questions from audience. I think if you're online, write a question in the chat, and we've got someone here monitoring that. If you're in the room, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, we have a question from the webinar. So someone asked The CBO estimates that a 10-year extension of the COVID-era healthcare subsidies will cost $410 billion, including interest. How would you propose to pay for the cost of the extension? I believe this question is for Sam.
Sure, and I think this really gets to the point that Andrew made about OBBBA being era-defining, because we have moved to a moment, we've moved to a politics in America that has an incredible budget constraint if we have the low tax policy of the of the 2017 Trump tax bill made permanent. And I think that's not helped by the way the Democratic Party approaches revenue, which is increasingly to essentially give ground on the question of taxes. For a while, I was very comfortable that we actually had a lot of room to borrow. And I think we do have a lot of room to borrow in this country, and we should think about borrowing as making an investment in this country the same way we do when we're buying a house. I don't think that the budgets of governments, and particularly the federal government, which has the control it does over the economy, is at all like the budget of an individual on a month-to-month basis. And I think the better way to think about it is, we really do have the opportunity to borrow, and it will be good for our economy long term if we do that. But I think with the substantial tax cuts and the substantial increase in benefits, what we've seen is a world where we have to think about sustaining the budget. And I think that means looking to revenue. I think that means making our tax system much more progressive. I think that it means, looking to things like wealth taxes, which obviously there will be constitutional fights about. But there are lots of opportunities, it seems to me, to raise revenue and pay for all of these things. The revenue is out there. The problem is we've made certain political decisions about it.
Can I jump in on that too? So yeah, I think that it is actually explained well by the making the tax cuts permanent. I also think it's important to put the budgetary debates in the full federal budget context, right? So a lot of people will say the federal government is a Navy with some health insurance. So part of the way we fund the federal government, and the bulk of the spending is for three things: Social Security, old age Social Security, not necessarily like the disability programs, Medicare, and defense through the Pentagon. And what has happened with the budgetary politics on the Hill is those have been kind of ring-fenced. And so, when Speaker Ryan wanted to cut Medicaid and SNAP, he was kind of like, John Dillinger, who was asked, why do you rob banks? It's because it's where the money is. I think their view was, this is the discretionary spending. You can't touch Social Security, Medicare, and the Pentagon, so we'll go after the next biggest budget items. But Medicaid and SNAP are actually not that big compared to those other three. And I would also contest to what extent Medicaid and the ACA subsidies, which are at issue in this discussion, are the real cost drivers of healthcare. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry and the amount of money spent on old age health insurance. So Medicaid's not necessarily the cost driver. And indeed, that was the thinking behind the Affordable Care Act in part, was how do you bend the cost curve? You actually get more young people into the insurance pool to drive down the costs given demographic aging. So I don't actually know what the cost curve is going to look like if we keep removing relatively healthy kids and young people from Medicaid and the ACA subsidies and continue to fund Medicare to the extent that we do, with diminishing revenue thanks to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
I want to jump onto that last point also, which is Medicaid had, according to some studies, and obviously these studies are never perfect, but Medicaid recoups about 59 cents on every dollar it spends in additional tax revenue paid to states, because the kids who get Medicaid benefits become healthier, more productive adults. So if you put any value at all on saving children's lives, and keeping them healthier and keeping them in insurance pools later, you only need 41 cents of every dollar to say that Medicaid is clearly cost benefit justified. Medicare, by contrast, which is not being attacked right now, spends about 95% of its spending on the last 6 months of life, keeping people alive, and recoups none of that money. So, people who are getting a ton of Medicare dollars are passing away within 6 months of what they're taking out of the federal revenue. So, if the question is being driven by a kind of like, well, we can't really afford this right now, it's not rational to spend this money, that's not really true. I think that there are lots of ways that we could reform the federal budget to make it more rational and to give ourselves better returns on our investments that are not being discussed politically right now. And part of it is because the benefits are sticky, especially old age benefits and Medicare benefits are extremely entrenched. But it's we're not having deeply rational conversations right now about money.
More questions?
Hi. Oh, I'm back here. Hi. Yeah, so I guess I just wonder if the politics of COVID weren't and aren't so weird as to defy kind of normal science political analysis. So for example, like probably the most successful government program in terms of like social surplus from COVID was Project Warp Speed and getting mRNA vaccines made and distributed, and there were subsidies to the development and market pre-commitments, and like, hey, wow, did that go great? And like, wouldn't it be great if the government was like continuing to invest in this like magical technology? And of course, the Trump administration did that, but then like immediately polarized itself against its own policy, which is crazy. And like now the second Trump administration is recommending against many vaccines, including the COVID vaccine the Trump administration made. I just find I have a hard time finding like an interest group story there where like employer power is kind of the actuating force. And I wonder if just like a lot of the stuff that happened during COVID was very much about COVID and like, I don't know, school shutdowns and mask policies and like packaging, policies together with a political coalition in a quasi-arbitrary way. And we just like can't learn anything from it.
Maybe. I mean, no, so totally possible, right? So there's a story you could tell, which is just, gosh, we did all this stuff in the middle of COVID because we were all scared to death, and bottom was dropping out of the economy and people didn't know what to do, and and what happened, so we had to throw a bunch of policies out there, and the reason why all the entrepreneurial members of Congress got all their stuff in the bills is because nobody was really thinking very hard about what was in the bills. It's just like, let's pass a bunch of stuff. Part of it was they were responding to the sense that Obama had failed by really trying to tinker with exactly the right policy and getting exactly the right amount of money, and everyone realized that in 2009 it was too little, so we're not going to do too little, we'll just do everything. The door's open, pretend it's Christmas. And then everyone got really mad about COVID, and everyone got really mad at each other about COVID, and everybody wanted COVID to be over. And, people were insisting it was over before, when people were dying by the millions. But even after that, some people wanted to wear masks all the time, and that made other people really mad. And then the Democrats were like, I don't know, this is making people mad. It's not our safe space. We're going to run away too, right? And so no broader lesson other than, 2020, 2021, they expanded a bunch of stuff. And then starting in 2021, everyone sees the politics turning, and they're, particularly late 2021, and they're like, okay, we got to pretend that COVID is over. And yeah, that stuff is going on for sure. And maybe that's right. I guess I am not of the view, I'm presenting this because I think it actually is a story that is a useful story, and I think there is a lesson to be learned there. But I'm not of the view that you can ever be certain about, any kind of causation in American politics or any politics. So, if it doesn't resonate with you and you think the story is like COVID is just sui generis, I can't dissuade you of that. I guess I can say, I think there's a fear that I have that COVID, although maybe it was sui generis at the time, has actually helped to generate a completely new politics around almost everything, like an almost nihilistic politics around almost everything, where everything is marked by the dynamics that we're talking about with COVID. And then I'd want to think through what that means. And I think some of what I get to toward the end of this paper is kind of thinking through what that means. But yeah, totally possible. COVID is just this thing. And look, I would love it. I think we all would love it if 20 years from now, like that was just a terrible thing we all went through. And boy, isn't it good we're through that. And it didn't have any lingering effects. I'm skeptical, but I could totally see it.
So this is like part of the reason that I love the Mills and the uncertainty principle, despite not needing them, which I completely acknowledge, but I love them anyway. So I'm playing with them through a whole series of writing. But part of the reason that I love them is because I think that lobbying and power are not sufficient explanations for what happens in American politics. I think there is a diffuse, soft, zeitgeisty, causal factor that we have to take into account, and it is driven by, I think, just a widespread public perception of the legitimacy of government and some of these competing theories about what role government ought to play in our lives. And for me, the uncertainty principle has so much explanatory power for the shifts in that soft part of what drives American politics that I think it becomes a useful lens through which to look at some of these things. So I'm gonna so with respect to warp speed and COVID vaccines and this, there's no power interest behind anti-vaxxers, right? There's no, the pharmaceutical companies obviously are against them because they want everybody taking vaccines. The doctors are against them because they want the fee-for-service payment for administering vaccines. The pharmacists are against them because they want the fee-for-service pay. Every moneyed interest that you can identify should be anti-vaxxer.
Well, the supplement industry. The supplement industry is pro-vaxxer, pro-anti-vaxxer.
Pro-anti-vaxxer, but they maybe are not particularly powerful.
Ivermectin guys.
The
guys
ivermectin guys. Well,
stuff.
okay, but but I do think that there's and by the way, I have to preface this by saying I am the last, I'm the farthest possible thing from an anti-vaxxer. I volunteered for the Pfizer clinical trial. I got shot up long before any of y'all. So but I do think that there is some logic under the uncertainty principle to saying you're imposing a concrete harm on me. You're sticking a needle in my arm. You're injecting me with something that's synthetic that I don't understand. It makes my arm hurt for 24 hours. And you're providing me with a very uncertain benefit. I don't know whether I'll get exposed to COVID and whether I actually need this vaccine or not. And so the benefit of widespread vaccination is herd immunity, not individual immunity. And so this, from the individualist perspective, the uncertainty principle says, we can't force you to get a vaccine. And it's only, you have to take that social perspective to say, yes, we can. And a lot of people who are kind of resistant to that solidaristic social perspective are gonna drive a zeitgeisty feeling of don't make us vaccinate. And so I think, that plays an important role that we neglect if we focus too much on the consolidated power of money.
Yeah, and I just want to get in on the idea of again, as I suggested in my remarks, I'm reluctant to kind of read political lessons into the policy experience of the COVID response. But I actually think we're going to have a ton of lessons about the efficacies of the policies. My concern is that it's going to be a little too late. So just to give you an example, Diane Schanzenbach and others have shown that in the rollout of the food stamp program from being a pilot program to a national program, states couldn't implement it statewide right away. So they had to roll it out in individual counties. And Schanzenbach and others, this is just applied microeconomics, have taken advantage of that uneven implementation to measure impacts. And they show that if you were 3 years old and your family started receiving food assistance, you're more likely to graduate from high school. You're more likely to earn more money later in life. Huge social investment. There's similar research on the GI Bill, Pell Grants. There's now more and more research on Medicaid, especially with the uneven expansion in the Obama administration. We're going to see that too with the child tax credit. Certainly. The problem is that, Sam mentioned that like we're seeing an erosion of trust in government. I just think we're seeing an erosion of trust, period. And so are we going to be able to learn the lessons from social science and the hard sciences about the COVID experience? And can that actually inform our politics if we are in such a kind of distrustful mood as a country, and with a splintered media landscape that doesn't really allow facts to get through?
Hi, my question's kind of two parts. It's about this idea that's maybe a little more popular in other countries, that there are just some things that are incident to life that it's worth the government just eating the cost because it's just a fact of life. What do you think is the efficacy, and to what extent is it possible feasible that the government, or just American society in general, adopts the idea that there are just some things that it's a profit is not necessary, or return is not necessary, and we as a society and as a government are okay with just fronting that cost?
Yeah, I mean, my own politics are, I would probably agree with that in a lot of circumstances, and I think particularly in a wealthy society like ours, that there are certain things that people ought to be entitled to just because they're people and they're here. And, there are a lot of people who feel that way, and it is probably significantly less than a majority of Americans who feel that way. So there's sort of that at the level of ideology, and then there's the policy fights to try to move toward that ideal or not. And those policy fights often involve making compromises with, people who don't necessarily believe in that ideal, but might be able to, might feel like they can justify a policy based on something else. I mean, I think that's sort of what the ultimate story of the COVID era expansions is. Like, there are some people who just wanted to expand this stuff in general, and we're seeing this as a good opportunity, but they wouldn't have had the political power to do this themselves. There were enough people who said, well, yeah, at this moment, this is really an emergency, and people aren't at fault for needing this stuff, so let's give it to them. I think there is a way in which some learning can take place around that. It's not like everybody believed before 1935 and 38 that there was a right to get taken care of in your retirement. A lot of people still don't believe that. But we're not going to take away Social Security. Even the attacks on Social Security are all oblique attacks on Social Security. And in part, that's because, the people who believed in that were able to get the Social Security Act enacted in 1938, and then were able to get people to see, yeah, this is actually something that really works. So I think there is a way that policy can be used to make a case for these broader ideals, and that, but that doesn't always work in the way that people assume it will. The case has to actually get made, because there will be people out there who have an ideological or other kind of reason to be opposed.
Can I just add too, and this goes back to kind of Sam's lecture and his paper, I think that it's more focusing on enlightened self-interest. And so for like employers, I always got the sense that you could imagine a universal healthcare system in this country that would actually benefit small businesses and employers because they're not having to shoulder as much cost, and HR departments have, if you look at an HR department in most American corporations now, it feels like a healthcare department because of all of the churn and the compliance they have to deal with. Also kind of query then whether like we would expect employer backlash from healthcare expansion during this moment. Same with school meals. Like I mean, for the law students in the room, like imagine trying to stay focused in class if you skipped breakfast and lunch and you're in class from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. But if we don't have school meals, then a lot of kids are showing up to school hungry, and we're expecting them to learn whether they're 6 or 16. It's a pretty cheap program, but I think it has demonstrably huge benefits. I just think it's a great social investment. The interesting thing about Social Security and Medicare, which is kind of submerged in some of our papers, is that there's a contributory element to it. So in your paycheck, you see yourself paying into OASDI and to Medicare, and that seems to change the politics. So during the Affordable Care Act, you have senior citizens saying, get your hands off my Medicare, and people are like kind of making fun of that, but I actually think there's something true to that if people feel like they're contributing to the system during their working years and then they are expecting some kind of return, even though that there is some squishy or fuzzy math about how that actually works, paying in and getting it out. But I think that kind of contributory element might be something that would be worth exploring in the next several years.
Let me just say one thing, just to jump in. I think the enlightened self-interest point on healthcare, I think, is in some ways the strongest argument that it's really employer class consciousness that is driving a lot of this, right? Because it would be much better for many employers if they didn't have to handle healthcare. And yet it was employers who were the biggest opponents of the Affordable Care Act, which would enable people to get health care not through their workplace.
Right, the Chamber of Commerce.
Right, it's the Chamber of Commerce, it's NFIB, it's all of these entities. And so that suggests that they include as part of their understanding of self-interest, their class interest as well. And I think that's, an important thing we have to take account of, that one of the reasons why I wrote this way, notwithstanding a lot of people want to push back on that, I think it's an important point about the politics here. Anyway, sorry, Abby.
No, that's fine. Now I'm tempted to jump in on Obamacare and push back on the employer class interest story, but I'm gonna actually not do that. But I have objections. But I think the one thing that I was going to say in response to feasibility of widespread social welfare in the United States and just public provision of certain kinds of basic necessities is that as long as there is a significant contingent of Americans who do not believe that that is appropriate, and that just by virtue of being present in the United States, you deserve public provision of certain goods and services, it won't be feasible. But if you persuade first, and whether it's through enlightened self-interest or through some other story of desert or or solidarity or whatever, right? If you engage in, if you being leaders who believe in this, engage in the project of persuasion first, then it becomes feasible, right? And so this is a big part of what I'm arguing and why I like the uncertainty principle, is that power is parasitic on the polity. Power is parasitic on who we vote for and who will support, and also our willingness to comply with the laws that government enacts. And so the first task in moral leadership can't be legislation; it has to be persuasion, if you want the legislation to function. And so so feasibility depends first on sentiment. And so if you're in that boat of wanting to move the United States toward a broader, more robust social welfare state, then you should not think of your task as, how do I design a statute? You should, I know in law school, this is not the best message to be sending you, but you shouldn't be thinking in terms of how do I write a statute or how do I bring a lawsuit. You should be thinking in terms of like what story will resonate with the people who disagree with me, and like how can I bring them on board? How can I convince them that their perspective is not correct? And that requires, and I think this is an important thing to say in this moment, like it requires engaging honestly, sincerely, openly, and with curiosity with the people who disagree with you. And so like you have to have that dialectic, you have to have that conversation in order to be able to move the needle. But that has to be step one before you start thinking about like, how do I design a program?
Well, and 2 points on that. I think Abby's point really buttresses Sam's paper, which is kind of against the deliverism of the Democratic Party, which was, we'll just do these things and the politics will work for them, for themselves. I also think that just like the focus on persuasion and then legislation is a good one, in part because we just have to acknowledge the general immiseration and degradation of economic security in this country for the last half century. And so I think it's really important to kind of recognize how the deck has been stacked against so many people now for multiple generations, whether because of discrimination, housing unaffordability, systematic disinvestment in education, no national plan for childcare. I think the failure, with the Build Back Better bill, the failure to kind of enact some kind of national childcare legislation is just going to continue to challenge low-income and middle-class families with the expectation that pretty much every family in this country is going to need all the adults in the household to work to get by, and we have no plan to take care of kids 0 to 5. So at the times when families are at their most economically insecure, there is a safety net full of holes to help them take care of their kids. When the economic reality is that all the adults who can work will have to work.
I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I have a question. This has been a great panel, very high-level conversation in these very interesting topics. So one thing that I want to ask is that, for the Biden administration, a lot of the proposals that you mentioned were part of reconciliation package, which has its own inherent issues, right, in terms of the amount that has to be spent and the fact that, and so when some of one of the things I remember reading about in the paper is that maybe not so much on sort of the healthcare issues. One of the things I remember reading about it was the child welfare or the child tax credit, that it was only for 1 year. And so one of the things I wonder about is like, when you look at that bill, that people might have been ticked off that they only had it for 1 year, right? It's not just that it became felt like it was a right. It was like, well, then they gave this to me and they took it away. And so, I go back to Professor Moncrieff's point about, sort of messaging, that so much of the messaging, is really terrible on one side. It's absolutely awful. And I do agree, also with Moncrieff that, a lot of it is storytelling. And I wouldn't say it's not what law school students do. I think storytelling is everything we do, right? Whether it's in a court of law or it's in legislation, it's all we do. It's not all we do, but it's when we are the most persuasive, we're in any area, it's where we are the most effective, is where we can break something down into a story that people can understand. And so I just want to address that. But the last point also is that I thought, in terms of Social Security and Medicare, it's not only that people are contributing, it's also that it's universal, so that everyone has a right to it. It's not sort of putting one group against the other. Anyone, if they get over 60, whatever it is now, you have a right to Medicare and Social Security. And as a result, it's not like we're not be fighting each other and say, you're deserving and not deserving. Well, we're all deserving. So I do think that may be a model for some things as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that all those points make a lot of sense. And I think, if I had been writing about the electoral consequences here, the dynamic that you talk about of raising expectations and then dashing them. We gave it to you for a year and took it away. You know, people have tried to tease out how much that affected the 2022 midterms without much success in really figuring it out. I think it's hard, but there are a lot of commentators who believe that that was at least one significant dynamic that was going on, and I would definitely credit that. I think that that's almost certainly right. And I think the problem was for the people who let it go with a year, and you talked about that it was budget reconciliation. One of the crucial pieces of budget reconciliation is, as part of the Byrd rule, it can't increase the deficit after 10 years, basically. And so there are lots of efforts to kind of keep the programs within bounds to meet budget understandings for purposes of reconciliation. And that was one crucial reason why we ended up with only 1 year. That wasn't the initial proposal. But the people who wanted it thought, well, after a year, everybody's going to be so ticked off to have it taken away that no one in Congress will be willing to take it away. And of course, there's a misalignment of interests. I mean, you know, Joe Manchin, in fact, didn't stand for re-election ever again. But even if he did, he was going to stand for re-election in West Virginia. Like, he wasn't really going to be the one who, at the margins, was going to have to worry about this being taken away. But it might still have had a big electoral effect. So I think that's right. And I think the contributory and universal nature of Social Security and how it's understood that way, I think really underscores a lot of my points. So thank you.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but join me in thanking our panel.